Hello dear students. Today we will see the another important property of a network called the clustering coefficient. So far when we study a network we may look at how many connections a node has. But here we are interested in something slightly different. So if we want to know two peoples are connected to the same person, are they also connected to each other? So this idea is measured using the cluster coefficient. For example, imagine three friends A, B and C. If A is friends with B and B is also friends with C and B and C are also friends with each other, then these three students form a triangle or what we call a trade. So the clustering coefficient tells us how strongly these local connections are grouped together. So clustering coefficient in real world networks. In neural networks, friendships are highly transitive. Friends of a user are often friends with one another. These friendships form triads. High average local clustering coefficient. So let us understand why clustering coefficient is important in real world networks. So what does transitive mean? Suppose A is friends with B and A is friends with C. There is a good possibility that B and C also friends. So friendships tend to form groups. For example, think about a group of college students. So that the triangle is the base here. So now look at the Facebook example. So in May 2011, Facebook users with two friends had an average clustering coefficient of 0.5. The important idea here is not simply the number 0.5. The important observation is friends of a user are often friends with one another. So this is the concept of clustering coefficient. So here the clustering coefficient for real network. So here we can see the clustering coefficient for different real world networks, social, technological, biological and information. So in a social network, we generally expect strong clustering because people who know the same person may know one another. So when we analyze a real world network, clustering coefficient helps us understand the local structure of the network. So the next one is average path length. So now we move from local connectivity to global connectivity. So the next concept is average path length. Suppose we have two people in a social network. So how many connections do we need to travel to reach one person from another, A to B to C and C to D? Here, to reach D from A, we need three links. So the path length is 3. So we calculate the shortest path between many pairs and then take the average. This gives us the average path length. So the how small is the world? So for example, rumor is spreading over a social network and assumes that every user immediately passes the rumor to all of their friends. So consider rumor spreading. Suppose one person starts a rumor, that person immediately tells all their friends. Then those friends immediately tell all of their friends and the process continues. So here, how long does it take to reach almost all of the node? What is the maximum time and what is the average time? So if the average path length is small, information can travel through the network very quickly. This is one of the important characteristics of a small world network. So in the Milgram's experiment, so famous experiment involving 296 random people from Nebraska and Boston sending a letter to a stockbroker. Of the letters that reached the target, 64 did so, with an average of around 6 links. So this is called Milgram's experiment. So in this experiment, 296 random people were selected. They came from Nebraska 196 people, Boston 100 people. So they were asked to send a letter to a particular stockbroker in Boston. But there was one important restriction, personally important restriction. They could not directly send the letter unless they personally know the target. So instead, they had to send it through people they personally know, people who were on a first name basis with them. So that so that among the letters that successfully reached the target, there were 64 successful letters. So the average number of links was around 6. So this result became famous because it demonstrated the idea that people in a large society may be connected through surprisingly short chains. So Milgram's experiment, 5.2 intermediate peoples. So the average number of intermediate people is 5.2. Here we have a more precise result from Milgram's experiment. The average number of intermediate people was 5.2. So if we say there are 5.2 intermediate people on average, this is describing the people between the original sender and the final target. So this experiment provided early evidence of the small world phenomenon. Even though the social network contains a very large number of people, two people may be connected through only a small number of intermediate connections. So the next one is Erdos number. So Erdos number is the number of links required to connect scholars to Paul Erdos through co-authored papers. Erdos wrote 1500 plus papers with 507 co-authors. So the average path is 4.65 and the maximum of 13 among mathematicians. So this time instead of friendship we use academic collaboration. This concept is called the Erdos number. So Erdos is a famous mathematician. Uh, Suppose I have not worked directly with Erdos, but I worked with someone who worked directly with Erdos. Then my Erdos number is 2. Similarly, Erdos to A to B, B to C. So C has an Erdos number of 3. So the Erdos number is basically a shortest path in co-authorship network. So that the average path length is 4.65 and the maximum is 30. So example of Erdos number 2. Now let's look at a very interesting example. So the Albert Einstein as an example of someone with an Erdos number of 2. How can Einstein have Erdos number 2? So let's understand the chain. First, Erdos to Weber-Stratus. They were connected through research collaboration. Then Weber-Stratus to Albert Einstein. So there were Erdos to Stratus and Stratus to Einstein. So there were two links. So that the Erdos number is. So the next one is the average shortest path. Now we come back to the general concept of average path length. Suppose we select any two people in a social network. There may be many possible routes between them, but we are interested in the shortest route. For example, A to B, B to C, C to D. So A to E, E to D. The first path has length of 3 and second path has length of 2. So that the average path length is between, we calculate the shortest path between any pairs of users and then take the average. So in this slide, the Facebook example of 2011, average path length is 4.7, users are 4.3. So different networks, average path length of different sample networks. So some other more properties of real world networks are, first one is friendship paradox and second one is the core periphery structure. So the paradox, friendship paradox. So your friends on average have more friends than you. So now we have very interesting and slightly surprising concept called the friendship paradox. So on average your friends have more friends than you do. At first this sounds strange. You may ask, how can this be true? My friends are just people in my network. Suppose we have four people. A has one friend, B has two friends, C has 10 friends and D has two friends. Now, suppose many people in the network are connected to C. So, C has the very high degree. That means C has many friends. So, when we select people through their friendships, people like C are more likely to appear because many people can point to C as their friend. So, the simple analogy is the friendship paradox. So, the next one is core periphery structure. So dense core, periphery nodes connected to the core, periphery nodes not connected among themselves, also called jellyfish or octopus structures. So now let's see the example. What is core? The core is the group of nodes that are highly interconnected. In other words, the core is dense. What is the periphery? Outside the core, we have periphery nodes. These nodes are connected to the core, but they may not be connected to each other. And jellyfish are octopus analogy. So, because if you visualize the network, the dense central group looks like the body or head, while the peripheral nodes extend outwards like tentacles. So, these are the some properties of real world networks. So then we can quickly summarize clustering coefficient. It tells us how strongly the neighbors of a node are connected to one another. Average path length. It tells us how many links are required on average to connect nodes in a network. And next one, small world network. Even very large networks can have shortest paths between nodes. And then Milgram's experiment. Next one is Erdos number. Then friendship paradox and then code periphery structure. So as the overall real world networks are not random collections of connections, they have recognizable structures such as high clustering, shortest paths, small world behavior, friendship paradox and core periphery organizations. Thank you students. In the next session we will see some more real world networks. Thank you all.